She looks like she wandered in from a bus stop." Dr. Julian Thorne's voice carried through the break room walls of St. Jude's Trauma Center, sharp enough to cut through the expensive espresso machine's hiss. Chief of Trauma Surgery, Harvard Medical, Instagram following, 340,000, untouchable. She's 45 if she's a day. Who starts their nursing rotation at 45? And have you seen her hands? They shake. Probably DTs, alcoholic or burned out. He paused, then added with a smirk, though I'm sure she's very articulate. Nurse Jessica Monroe laughed. Where did they even find her? Probably some diversity quota thing. Urban youth program gone wrong, Greg Evans chimed in, and the room erupted in laughter. Sarah Mitchell stood in the hallway, arms full of soiled linens, and heard every word. 45 years old, dark brown skin, natural hair pulled back in a simple bun. 3 weeks at St. Jude's, silent as a shadow. To people like Thorne, she was either invisible or a target. What Dr. Thorne did next would cost him everything he'd ever built. Comment where you're listening from. Subscribe to channel. But here's what nobody knew about the woman they called the Mute. Sarah Mitchell wasn't her real name, not the one that mattered anyway. The real Sarah Mitchell had died 3 years ago in the Argonne Dab Valley when an IED turned a convoy into a crematorium. The woman who walked out of that fire was something else entirely, something the polished doctors of St. Jude's couldn't begin to understand. She was born Sarah Mitchell in Oakland, California, 1980. South Side. Daughter of a single mother who worked double shifts at the county hospital as a nurse's aide, came home smelling like bleach and exhaustion, and still found time to help Sarah with her homework. Her father? Gone before she could remember. Just another black man the system swallowed whole. Her mother saved every penny to send Sarah to college, believing America rewarded hard work if you were twice as good and worked twice as hard. But Sarah didn't go to nursing school. Not at first. At 17, she walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office in downtown Oakland. The recruiter, a white man with a crew cut and a Confederate flag tattoo barely hidden under his sleeve, took one look at her. A young black woman with natural hair and quiet determination in her eyes, and laughed. "You sure you're in the right place, sweetheart? The welfare office is 2 blocks down." Sarah had stared at him, her jaw set. "I want to be a combat medic." His smile disappeared. "We don't do affirmative action in the Corps, honey. This isn't college." "Good," Sarah said. "Then judge me by my scores." She enlisted the day after her 18th birthday. Her mother didn't speak to her for 6 months. But Sarah had seen something her mother hadn't. She'd watched her mother work herself to exhaustion for poverty wages. She'd watched the system fail them both. She decided she'd learn to save people the system left behind. What happened next changed everything. Boot camp, medic training, advanced trauma life support. Sarah excelled, top of her class, but that wasn't enough for her. In 2003, she applied for the Para-Rescue Pipeline, the most elite combat medical program in the military. PJs, they called them. So others may live. Only men had ever completed it, and no black women had even been allowed to try. The instructors told her she'd wash out in a week. One even pulled her aside before training started. "Listen, I'm not racist or anything, but physically, your people aren't built for this. It's just biology. Maybe try something more, suited to your strengths." Sarah looked him dead in the eye. "My people survived the Middle Passage, slavery, Jim Crow, and redlining. I think I can handle your obstacle course." She became the first woman to graduate the program. The first black woman. 20 months of hell that would have broken men twice her size. Call sign? Angel. But the racism didn't stop with graduation. It just got quieter, more professional. For 20 years, Sarah Mitchell deployed to places the government wouldn't admit existed. She jumped out of helicopters into active combat zones. She performed emergency surgery in ditches while bullets snapped overhead. She carried men twice her size out of kill zones on her back. 400 combat saves. Confirmed. And through it all, she had to be perfect. Because one mistake from a black woman in a white man's world wasn't just a mistake. It was proof that she never belonged there in the first place. She watched white male medics make errors and get second chances. She watched them get promoted for doing the same work she did. She heard the whispers. Diversity hire, affirmative action, DEI candidate. She didn't complain. She just worked harder. But nobody knew that now. Because 3 years ago, everything changed. The IED in Argonne Dab didn't just destroy the convoy. It destroyed the woman Sarah had been. Traumatic brain injury, spinal fractures, titanium rods holding her together, medical retirement at age 42, honorable discharge. Thank you for your service. The silence of civilian life nearly killed her. For 2 years, she drifted. The VA gave her pills and appointments that took 6 months to schedule. The pills made her numb. The numbness made her invisible, which, as a black woman veteran, she'd already been. The civilian world didn't know what to do with her. She was too qualified for entry-level positions, but not a culture fit for anything better. She'd spent 20 years being vital, necessary, the difference between life and death. Now she was just another middle-aged black woman with shaking hands and nightmares nobody wanted to hear about. When she applied to nursing positions under her real credentials, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, Pararescue, 400 combat saves, she got rejection after rejection. Overqualified. We're looking for someone with more recent civilian experience. We're going in a different direction. Translation: we don't want you. That's when she applied to St. Jude's, not under her real credentials. She couldn't handle the attention, the questions, the hero worship from people who'd never held someone's intestines in their hands while calling in a medevac. She applied as Sarah Mitchell. Associate degree in nursing. Previous experience, nursing home care. References, unremarkable. She just wanted to be useful again. Quietly. This was her first mistake. St. Jude's Trauma Center wasn't a hospital. It was a kingdom, and Dr. Julian Thorne was its uncrowned prince. Thorne came from Connecticut money. Old money mixed with new. His father owned pharmaceutical patents worth $400 million. His mother sat on the boards of 3 hospitals and a medical school. Julian himself had graduated Yale undergrad, Harvard Medical, and done his surgical residency at Johns Hopkins. At 38, he was the youngest chief of trauma surgery in St. Jude's 140-year history. His Instagram showed him in designer scrubs, posting motivational quotes about excellence and discipline. His TikTok featured him doing surgery demonstrations set to pop music. He had 340,000 followers who called him Dr. Dreamy and sent him marriage proposals. He was also a coward who froze under pressure, but nobody knew that yet. Sarah's first day at St. Jude's, nurse manager Karen Hartley handed her a mop. "The regular janitorial staff called out sick," Karen said, not meeting Sarah's eyes. "I need you to cover the 4th floor surgical wing." Sarah took the mop. She didn't argue. She'd cleaned latrines in 120-degree heat in Kandahar. She could clean floors. But this wasn't about cleaning. This was about putting her in her place. Every day for 3 weeks, they found new ways to humiliate her. Greg Evans, a second-year resident with a trust fund and an attitude problem, threw his dirty lab coat at her. "Take that to laundry and grab me a coffee. Black, like you." He laughed like it was a joke. Sarah didn't react. Jessica Monroe, lead surgical nurse and Thorne's rumored girlfriend, assigned Sarah to graveyard shifts nobody else wanted. midnight to 8 a.m., 6 days a week. "Someone your age should be grateful to have any shifts at all," Jessica said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then, lowering her voice, "And between you and me, we have standards here. This isn't, well, you know." Sarah knew. Dr. Thorne himself never spoke directly to Sarah. He didn't have to. His contempt was clear in the way he'd hand instruments to other nurses and ignore her completely, even when she was standing right there. The way he'd sigh dramatically if she entered a room. The way he'd clutch his wallet if she walked past. The way he'd make jokes about senior citizen nursing students and urban healthcare workers that everyone laughed at. Nobody helped. Nobody spoke up. This is when Sarah started to understand what was really happening. It wasn't just ageism or casual workplace cruelty. It was a test. The elite doctors and nurses of St. Jude's had a culture, an ecosystem. They were protecting it. Anyone who didn't fit, anyone who didn't look like them, sound like them, come from their neighborhoods, anyone who threatened the hierarchy, anyone who made them uncomfortable by existing in a space that wasn't meant for them, had to be broken down or driven out. Sarah had seen this before. In the military, they'd at least been direct about it. Here, in the civilian world of prestigious hospitals and powerful doctors, it was all smiles and microaggressions, death by 1,000 cuts. She'd survived worse. She'd survived being the only black woman in rooms full of men who didn't think she belonged. She'd survived instructors who wanted her to fail. She'd survived combat. She could survive this. She decided to outlast them. What she didn't know was that Commander Marcus Breaker Hayes was about to change everything. November 14th, 2023. 2:47 p.m. The hospital PA system crackled with a tone Sarah hadn't heard before. 3 sharp blasts. Code black. Mass casualty. ETA 3 minutes. The break room emptied instantly. Dr. Thorne sprinted toward Trauma Bay 1, barking orders. "Jessica, Prepper 1. Greg, get the blood bank on the line. This is it, people. We have VIPs coming in from the airfield." Sarah stood by the linen cart, not assigned to the trauma bay. Her job was to mop up afterward. But as the sirens wailed closer, she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. The rhythmic thumping of a Pive Hawk helicopter. That wasn't a civilian medevac. That was a military special operations bird. Sarah's hands, which had been shaking slightly, went completely still. Something had gone very, very wrong. The trauma bay doors exploded open. Paramedics burst in, accompanied by 2 massive men in tactical gear and earpieces. They wheeled in a stretcher. The patient was a catastrophe of blood-soaked gauze and shattered bone. "Male, early 40s, multiple gunshot wounds to thoracic cavity," the lead paramedic shouted, voice cracking. "BP 60 over 40 and dropping. 40. We lost his pulse twice in the bird." Dr. Thorne stepped up, ego swelling to fill the room. "I've got this. Clear the way. Get a line in him. Type and cross-match for O-neg, stat." The tactical operators hovered like attack dogs. One of them, a bearded giant with a scar running down his neck, grabbed Thorne's scrub sleeve. "Doc," the man growled. "This is Commander Hayes. You lose him, there's no hole deep enough for you to hide in." Thorne yanked his arm away. "Get these men out of my OR. I'm trying to save a life here." Security ushered the operators out. The tension remained thick enough to drown in. On the table, Commander Marcus Hayes was dying. Sarah shouldn't have been there. She was supposed to be restocking supply closets on the 4th floor. But something pulled her toward the trauma bay. Old instincts. The sound of the helicopter. The controlled chaos that wasn't quite controlled enough. She slipped into the observation area, staying in the shadows. On the table, Hayes was coding. The monitor screamed a flat, dissonant tone. "Fib!" Jessica screamed. "Paddles!" "Charge to 200, Thorne yelled. "Clear." Thump. Nothing. "Charge to 300. Thump. Come on. Thorne was sweating now. The confident surgeon was cracking. Sarah watched his hands, watched the way he was focusing on the chest wounds, missing the bigger picture. There was too much blood. The arterial spray was hitting the floor every time they did compressions, but it wasn't coming from the chest cavity alone. Sarah saw what Thorne missed. Hayes's abdomen was distended, tight as a drum. The bleeding wasn't external. It was junctional, high femoral artery, hidden by the shredded tactical pants. Thorne was pumping the blood out of Hayes with every compression. "Where's the bleeder?" Thorne screamed. "I can't see anything through this mess." Sarah moved. She didn't think. 20 years of muscle memory took over. She walked past the observation glass, through the scrub room, and into the trauma bay. "Hey!" Greg stepped in front of her. "What are you doing? You're not authorized—" Sarah shoved him. Not a push, a tactical strike, shoulder to sternum. Greg stumbled backward into a cart of instruments, the breath knocked out of him. "Hey!" Thorne looked up, eyes wide with rage. "What the hell are you doing? Security!" Sarah ignored him. She reached the table. She didn't look at Thorne. She looked at the wound on Hayes's upper thigh, the one hidden by the trauma of the chest injuries. "He's bleeding out from the femoral," Sarah said. Her voice dropped an octave into the command voice that had directed fire teams under mortar attack. "Stop compressions. You're pumping the blood out of him." "You're fired," Thorne roared. "Get away from my patient." Sarah didn't flinch. She jammed her fist, her entire gloved fist, deep into the wound on Hayes's groin. It was a brutal, archaic maneuver, the kind of battlefield medicine that doesn't exist in sterile surgical bays. The room went silent. "I said stop compressions," Sarah repeated, staring Thorne dead in the eyes. "Look at the monitor." Thorne looked. The blood pressure, which had been flatlining, gave a small, weak blip. Then another. The massive arterial spray coating the floor slowed to a trickle. By applying direct manual pressure to the artery against the pelvic bone, Sarah had crimped the hose. He stabilized," Jessica whispered, staring at the screen. This was Sarah's second mistake. Sarah didn't smile. She was sweating, her face pale, her hands shaking from the exertion. But her grip was iron. "Clamp," Sarah said. She didn't ask. She ordered. Thorne stood frozen, his brain unable to process what was happening. The janitor nurse, the one he'd mocked for trembling hands, was currently elbow-deep in a Navy SEAL, holding his life together with sheer brute force. "I said give me a damn vascular clamp, doctor," Sarah barked. Thorne snapped out of it. He grabbed the instrument and handed it to her. With a dexterity that belied her earlier shaking, Sarah navigated the blood-slicked cavity, found the torn artery, and clamped it blind. She slowly withdrew her hand. The monitor held steady. "Now," Sarah said, peeling off her blood-soaked gloves and tossing them into the bin. "You can treat the chest wounds. He won't bleed out while you do it." She turned to walk away. "Wait," Thorne stammered. Who are you?" Sarah paused at the door. The adrenaline was fading. The familiar ache in her spine was returning, the titanium rods reminding her she wasn't 25 anymore. She looked at the floor. "Just the new nurse," she said quietly. She walked out. But as she left, the trauma bay doors swung open again. The two operators from before, the ones security had kicked out, were standing there. They'd seen the last 30 seconds through the observation glass. The giant with the beard stared at Sarah as she walked past. His eyes went wide. He looked at her face, then at the way she walked, favoring her left leg slightly. "Angel," the operator whispered. Sarah didn't stop. She kept walking until she reached the locker room, where she sat on a bench and buried her face in her hands. She had broken cover. She had broken protocol. and she had definitely just gotten herself fired. What happened next will shock you. Inside the trauma bay, Commander Hayes's vitals were stabilizing. But the drama was far from over. Dr. Thorne was already spinning the narrative in his head. By the time he walked into Administrator Marcus Sterling's office 2 hours later, he had a full story prepared. "She assaulted a resident, Marcus," Thorne said, smoothing his pristine white coat. "She physically shoved Dr. Evans, and then she shoved her unwashed hands into a sterile surgical cavity. It's a miracle Commander Hayes didn't go into septic shock immediately. I had to intervene, repair the damage she caused, and stabilize the patient myself." Administrator Sterling tapped his pen on the mahogany desk. Sterling was 62, silver-haired, and cared more about St. Jude's endowment fund than actual patient care. "But the patient is alive." "Because of me," Thorne lied without blinking. "I guided the team. She was a disruption, a dangerous, unhinged disruption. I want her license revoked, and I want her gone. If the Navy finds out a geriatric, shaky-handed nurse was manhandling a SEAL commander, we'll lose the military contract." Sterling nodded slowly. "You're right. We can't risk the liability. Draft the termination papers. I'll have security escort her out before the shift change." While the administration plotted her demise, Sarah was down in the sterilization room, scrubbing instruments. The water was scalding hot, turning her hands raw and red. But she didn't feel it. She was lost in a memory. A dust storm in the Argon Dab Valley. The smell of burning diesel. The weight of a dying boy in her arms, who kept asking for his mother in a language she didn't speak. She knew she was done. She knew Thorne would spin it. In the civilian world, results didn't matter as much as protocol. In her old life, if you saved the hostage, you were a hero. Here, if you saved the patient but didn't fill out the right form, you were a liability. Up in the ICU, the atmosphere was heavy. Commander Marcus "Breaker" Hayes was awake, though heavily sedated. He was a man carved from granite, with eyes that had seen too much darkness to ever truly close. His team, the operators who'd brought him in, were standing guard. They refused to leave the room despite the nurses' protests. "Unit integrity," the bearded giant, whom the others called Dutch, growled at a terrified nurse. "We don't break it." Dr. Thorne breezed into the room, a practiced smile plastered on his face. He held a clipboard. "Gentlemen," Thorne nodded to the operators, then turned to the bed. "Commander, good to see you with us. That was a close call. Touch and go. But I managed to clamp the femoral just in time. You're a lucky man." Hayes blinked, his vision clearing. He looked at Thorne. He looked at the surgeon's soft, manicured hands. "You!" Hayes rasped. His voice sounded like grinding stones. "Yes," Thorne beamed. "I'm Dr. Thorne, Chief of Trauma Surgery. I led the team." Hayes frowned. The memory was fragmented. Flashes of white light and searing pain. But he remembered a sensation. A grip. It hadn't been the tentative, probing touch of a surgeon afraid to break something. It had been a violent, decisive intrusion that hurt like hell, but stopped the cold feeling of death spreading in his legs. And he remembered a voice. Not this man's smooth baritone. A woman's voice, raspy, smoky, commanding. "There was a woman," Hayes whispered. Thorne's smile didn't waver, but his eyes tightened. "Ah, yes, the nurses. They were assisting me. Standard procedure." "No," Hayes said, struggling to sit up before the pain forced him back. "Not a nurse, a soldier." Thorne laughed lightly, a condescending sound. "The anesthesia plays tricks on the mind, Commander. There are no soldiers on my medical staff. Just highly trained doctors. Now rest. You need your strength." Thorne turned to leave, signaling the nurses to increase the sedative. But as he walked past Dutch, the giant operator stepped into his path. Dutch was 6'5" and built like a tank. Doc, Dutch said. Yes? Thorne looked annoyed. Who was the woman with the gray eyes? The one who walked out? Thorne scoffed. A nobody. A temp nurse. She's being terminated as we speak for incompetence. Don't worry. She won't be anywhere near the commander again. Thorne walked out, feeling triumphant. Dutch watched him go. Then he looked back at Hayes. The commander's eyes were open, and the fog was clearing. Dutch, Hayes whispered. I'm here, boss. He's lying, Hayes said. I know. Find her. This is when everything changed. Sarah sat in the small, windowless office of Human Resources. Across from her sat Karen Hartley, who looked more bored than angry. Ms. Mitchell, Karen sighed, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. Dr. Thorne has filed a formal incident report. Insubordination, physical assault on a resident, and practicing outside the scope of your nursing license. We have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately. Sarah looked at the paper. Termination. She didn't argue. She didn't explain that Thorne had been freezing up, or that the resident had been in the way. She simply nodded. Okay, Sarah said softly. Please hand over your badge, Karen said. Sarah unclipped the plastic ID from her scrub top and placed it on the desk. It felt lighter than it should. You have 20 minutes to clear out your locker. Security will escort you to the exit. Sarah stood up. Her back ached. The old shrapnel wound in her hip was throbbing, a reminder that it was going to rain soon. She walked out of the office, flanked by 2 security guards who looked at her like she was a criminal. They marched her through the main hallway. It was shift change. The hallway was crowded with doctors, nurses, and residents. They all stopped to watch. News travels fast in a hospital. Everyone knew. The weird mute nurse had finally snapped and gotten fired. Good riddance, Greg, the resident she'd shoved, sneered as she passed. He was holding an ice pack to his chest. Hope you enjoy flipping burgers. Nurse Jessica was there, too, shaking her head. I told you she wasn't cut out for this. Too unstable. Sarah kept her eyes forward. She carried a small cardboard box containing a stethoscope, a spare pair of socks, and a framed photo of a dog that had passed away years ago. That was it. That was her whole life at St. Jude's. She reached the lobby. The automatic doors were just ahead. Freedom. Silence. Hold it! The shout was so loud it rattled the glass in the reception booth. The security guard stopped. Sarah stopped. Down the long corridor coming from the elevators was a phalanx of men. It was Dutch and 3 other operators. They weren't walking. They were moving with a purpose that made the doctors and visitors scramble out of the way. Dutch spotted Sarah. He pointed a finger at her. You, Dutch bellowed. Don't move. The security guards put their hands on their belts. They didn't carry guns, just tasers. Sir, you can't be down here. This is a restricted... Dutch didn't even look at the guard. He just kept walking until he was standing 2 feet from Sarah. He towered over her. The hallway went dead silent. Everyone was watching. Was she in trouble? Had she hurt the patient? Was this the military police coming to arrest her? Greg smirked. Oh, this is going to be good. They're going to arrest her. Dutch looked down at Sarah. He looked at the cardboard box in her hands. Then he looked at her face, studying the scar above her eyebrow, the gray eyes, the way she stood with her weight distributed evenly, ready to move. Ma'am, Dutch said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. Commander Hayes is asking for you. Sarah tightened her grip on the box. I don't work here anymore. I was just fired. Dutch's head snapped up. He looked around the lobby, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Dr. Thorne, who had just come down to enjoy the show. Fired? Dutch repeated, the word heavy with menace. She nearly killed the patient, Thorne shouted from the back, trying to regain control of the narrative. She is a danger to this hospital. Officers, remove her." Dutch turned his body slowly toward Thorne. The other 3 operators fanned out, creating a protective perimeter around Sarah. It was a subtle tactical move. Diamond formation, used to protect a VIP. "Nearly killed him?" Dutch asked, his voice low. "Yes," Thorne sputtered, his face turning red. That man up there is alive because someone knew how to crimp a femoral artery without seeing it," Dutch interrupted. "And I know for a fact, doctor, that it wasn't you. I saw the security footage from the bay." A gasp went through the lobby. "That's confidential property," Thorne protested. "It's evidence," Dutch corrected. "And I saw a woman with a distinct limp and a left-handed clamp technique save my CO's life while you were screaming for electricity." Dutch turned back to Sarah. He saw the way she was looking at the floor, trying to disappear. He saw the shame she shouldn't be feeling. "We checked your file, ma'am," Dutch said softly, so only she could hear. "Or the file you gave HR, Sarah Mitchell, associate's degree in nursing, previous experience, nursing home." Sarah didn't look up. "But then I made a call to a friend at the Pentagon," Dutch continued. "I gave him your vitals and your description, and he told me there is no Sarah Mitchell matching your profile." Sarah's eyes snapped to his. "He told me," Dutch smiled, a sad, respectful smile, "that there is a Jane Doe, retired from the 24th Special Tactics Squadron, call sign Angel. The only woman, the only black woman, to ever complete the PJ pipeline and serve with the teams. Off the books, credited with 400 combat saves, one of the most decorated medics in Special Operations history." Dutch's voice grew louder, addressing the whole lobby now. "This woman saved more American lives in 1 year than everyone in this hospital will save in their entire careers, and you people treated her like she was nothing." The box slipped from Sarah's hands. It hit the floor with a thud. The whisper ran through the crowd like wildfire. "Special tactics, 400 saves, PJ pipeline." "I don't care if she's Florence Nightingale," Thorne pushed his way to the front. "She broke protocol. She is fired. She isn't going anywhere." "She isn't going anywhere!" A voice boomed from the elevators. The crowd parted. A wheelchair was being pushed forward by a terrified nurse. In it sat Commander Hayes. He was pale, hooked up to a portable IV and a monitor, and he looked like death warmed over. But he was sitting upright. "Commander, you cannot be out of bed," Thorne shrieked. Hayes ignored him. He looked across the lobby at Sarah. Their eyes locked. For the first time in years, Sarah felt seen. Not as a janitor, not as a screw-up, but as who she was. Hayes raised a trembling hand. He didn't point. He slowly, painfully brought his hand up to his brow. He saluted her. Dutch and the 3 other operators snapped to attention. Their boots slammed into the linoleum floor in unison. Crack! They raised their hands in a sharp, crisp salute. The silence in the lobby was deafening. "Lieutenant," Hayes rasped, using her old rank, "I believe you have my life in your hands again." Sarah's lip trembled. She fought it, but a single tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. She slowly straightened her posture. The slouch of the tired nurse vanished. Her shoulders squared. Her chin rose. She returned the salute. "Commander," she whispered. The truth they buried for 3 years. Thorne looked around, realizing the tide had turned violently against him. This is ridiculous," he stammered. "This is a hospital, not a parade ground. Security." "Shut up," Administrator Sterling said. He had appeared on the balcony overlooking the lobby. He'd been watching the whole thing. He looked down at Thorne. "Shut up, Julian." Sterling walked down the stairs. He approached Sarah. He looked at the operators, then at the commander, and finally at the new nurse he had just ordered. Fired. Mitchell, Sterling said, his voice shaking slightly. It seems there has been a significant misunderstanding regarding your employment status. No misunderstanding, Sarah said, her voice regaining that steel from the trauma bay. She looked at Thorne. I quit. No, Hayes said from the wheelchair. He rolled forward until he was right in front of her. You don't. He looked up at her. I have a mission for you, Angel, Hayes said, and it pays better than this place. But before Sarah could answer, the hospital doors blew open again. This time it wasn't a patient. It was a man in a black suit, holding a briefcase, followed by 2 state troopers. Dr. Julian Thorne? The man in the suit asked. Thorne blinked. I am Dr. Thorne. I'm from the Medical Ethics Board, the man said. We just received a digital packet containing security footage of Trauma Bay 1, along with audio logs of you falsifying patient records. Thorne went pale. He looked at Dutch. Dutch held up his phone and winked. You're suspended pending an immediate investigation, the man in the suit said. Troopers, please escort the doctor off the premises. As Thorne was dragged away, kicking and screaming about his reputation, the lobby erupted into applause. Not for Thorne. They were clapping for Sarah. But the story wasn't over, because the mission Hayes had mentioned wasn't just a job offer. It was a warning. The applause in the lobby died down as quickly as it had started, replaced by a cold, vibrating tension that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand up. Commander Hayes didn't smile. He grabbed Sarah's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for a man who had flatlined an hour ago. Angel, Hayes whispered, his voice low enough that only she and Dutch could hear. They didn't just ambush us. They hunted us. Blackwell, they know I have the encryption key. They know I'm here. And they don't leave loose ends. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Blackwell. A rogue private military contractor that operated outside the law, ruthless, efficient, heavily armed. If Blackwell was coming, hospital security wouldn't stand a chance. How long do we have? Sarah asked, her voice shifting seamlessly back to the tactical cadence of a lieutenant. They hit the convoy at 1400. Dutch checked his watch. They'll track the medevac bird. They know we're stationary. I'd say we have less than 20 minutes before the first scout team breaches. Sarah turned to the stunned crowd of doctors and nurses. Administrator Sterling was still standing there, looking confused. Greg and Jessica were staring at Sarah like she was an alien. Listen to me, Sarah shouted. The rasp in her voice was gone, replaced by pure command presence. We are locking down this hospital. This is no longer a medical facility. It is a defensive hard point. You can't just... Sterling started to protest. If you want to live, you will do exactly what I say. Sarah cut him off. She turned to Dutch. Dutch, take your team and secure the ground floor entrances. Use the vending machines and heavy furniture to barricade the glass doors. Nothing gets in. Roger that, LT, Dutch said, grinning as he racked the slide of his concealed sidearm. Sarah turned to Greg. The arrogant resident was trembling. Greg, Sarah said sharply. Yes? Take Jessica and move all patients from the south wing into the interior corridors, away from the windows. Turn off the lights. Do it now. But Dr. Thorne said... Jessica stammered. Thorne is gone, Sarah snapped. I am the ranking officer on this deck. Move. They moved. Sarah wheeled Hayes back towards the elevator. We're going to the 4th floor. Surgery. It has the thickest walls, limited access points, and backup generators. As they reached the 4th floor, the hospital hummed with a terrified energy. Sarah pushed Hayes into Trauma Room 3, the room farthest from the elevators. She began stripping the room of non-essentials. You need a weapon, Hayes said, reaching for the holster on the pile of his bloody clothes that had been bagged up. It was empty. The paramedics had removed his Sig Sauer. I have weapons, Sarah said, opening a drawer. She pulled out a scalpel, a roll of heavy surgical tape, and a pressurized canister of ethanol. Suddenly, the hospital lights flickered and died. Total darkness. The backup generators kicked in a second later, bathing the hallways in a dim, eerie red emergency light. Click. The intercom system crackled. But it wasn't the hospital operator. Commander Hayes, a distorted, digitized voice echoed through the speakers. We know you're on the 4th floor. Send the encryption key down in the elevator and we will leave the civilians alone. You have 5 minutes. Sarah looked at Hayes. They're bluffing, Hayes said. They'll kill everyone to cover their tracks. Sarah walked to the double doors of the surgical ward. She looked through the small glass window. The elevator at the far end of the hall dinged. The doors opened. 4 men stepped out. They wore black tactical gear, gas masks, and carried silenced submachine guns. They moved with fluid, professional precision. Blackwell operators. They weren't here to negotiate. Sarah turned to the nurses' station where Greg and Jessica were cowering behind the desk. Get into the supply closet, Sarah whispered. Lock the door. Do not open it unless you hear my voice. What are you going to do? Greg whispered, tears streaming down his face. You don't have a gun. Sarah looked at the scalpel in her hand. She looked at the fire extinguisher on the wall. She looked at the shadows stretching down the hallway. I'm going to triage the situation, Sarah said. She slipped into the darkness of the hallway, disappearing like a ghost. What happened next would become legend. The hallway was silent except for the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the Blackwell operators' boots. They moved in a stack, checking rooms one by one. Kick, clear, move, kick, clear, move. They were getting closer to Trauma Room 3. The lead operator signaled to stop. He saw something on the floor. It was a wheelchair, overturned. A distraction. Check right, the leader whispered into his comms. The second man peeled off to check the linen closet. He opened the door. Whoosh! A blast of white powder exploded into his face. Sarah had rigged a dry chemical fire extinguisher to the door handle with surgical tape. The operator gagged, blinded, flailing his arms. In the confusion, a shadow dropped from the ceiling panels above them. It was Sarah. She didn't land on the ground. She landed on the third man's back. Before he could raise his weapon, she jammed a syringe into the exposed gap of his neck armor. Succinylcholine, a paralytic agent used for intubation. The man dropped like a stone, his muscles seizing instantly. The leader spun around, firing blindly. Bullets chewed up the drywall, but Sarah was already moving. She rolled under a gurney, sliding across the polished floor like a baseball player stealing home. She came up behind the blinded man, who was still pawing at his eyes. She kicked the back of his knee, bringing him down, and snatched the MP5 submachine gun from his hands. Contact rear! The leader screamed. Sarah didn't hesitate. She wasn't a nurse anymore. She was Angel. She fired 2 controlled bursts. The leader took a hit to his vest and stumbled back, taking cover behind the nurse's station desk. The fourth man sprayed fire down the hall, forcing Sarah to dive into an open patient room. She's armed! The leader yelled. Flank her! Frag out! A grenade skittered across the floor, stopping just outside Sarah's door. Sarah saw it. She didn't have time to run. She grabbed a heavy lead-lined apron used for X-ray protection that was hanging on the door hook. She threw it over the grenade and dove behind the solid oak bed frame. Boom! The explosion shook the floor. The lead apron absorbed most of the shrapnel, but the concussion wave rattled Sarah's teeth and made her ears ring. Dust and smoke filled the corridor. Move up, move. She's stunned, the leader commanded. The 2 remaining operators advanced through the smoke. Sarah was dazed. Her vision swam. Blood trickled from her nose. She checked the MP5, jammed from the impact. Useless. She looked around the room. An oxygen tank, a defibrillator. She grabbed the defibrillator paddles and hit the charge button. Whine. Clear. Left, a voice said right outside the door. A black boot stepped into the room. Sarah didn't wait. She lunged. She didn't aim for the man. She aimed for his weapon. She battered the barrel aside with her left hand, screaming as the hot suppressor burned her palm. With her right hand, she slammed the defibrillator paddle against the man's chest, right over his heart. Clear! Sarah yelled. Zap! 360 joules of electricity surged through the operator. His body went rigid. His finger clamped down on the trigger, sending a spray of bullets into the ceiling before he collapsed, convulsing. One man left. The leader. Sarah grabbed the fallen man's pistol. A Glock 19. She rolled onto her back, aiming at the door. But no one came in. Silence. You're good, the leader's voice called out from the hallway. For a nurse. I'm not a nurse, Sarah called back, her voice steady despite the pain in her hand. I know, the voice said. Angel, we read your file. Pity, you could have worked for us. I don't work for traitors. Then you die. A metal canister rolled into the room. Not a frag grenade. Flashbang. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut and covered her ears. Bang! Even with her eyes closed, the light was blinding. Her ears screamed. She was disoriented. The leader stormed the room. He saw her on the floor. He raised his rifle to her head. Goodbye, Angel. Click. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. He had fired his last rounds at the ceiling during the confusion with his partner. The leader cursed and reached for his sidearm, but the half-second delay was all Sarah needed. She didn't shoot him. She swept his legs. He hit the ground hard. Sarah was on top of him instantly. It was a brawl now. Brutal close-quarters combat. He was stronger, heavier. He punched her in the face, splitting her lip. She took the hit and head-butted him, her forehead smashing into his nose. He roared and grabbed her throat, squeezing. Black spots danced in Sarah's vision. She couldn't breathe. Her hand scrabbled on the floor. She felt cold metal. A pair of trauma shears she had dropped earlier. With her last ounce of strength, she drove the shears down into the weak point of his tactical vest, the shoulder strap connection. He screamed and released her. Sarah rolled away, gasping for air. She grabbed the Glock she had dropped. The leader stumbled to his feet, pulling a knife. Stay down, Sarah warned. He lunged. Bang, bang. 2 shots to the chest. The leader fell backward, crashing into a cart of sterile gauze. Silence returned to the 4th floor. Sarah sat there for a moment, panting, blood dripping from her nose and lip. Her scrub top was torn, revealing the old scars on her arms. Is it over? Sarah spun around, gun raised. It was Greg. He was peeking out of the supply closet, his face pale as a sheet. He looked at the bodies of the highly trained Blackwell mercenaries scattered in the hallway. He looked at the burnt mark on the wall from the grenade. And then he looked at Sarah. She was covered in dust, blood, and sheetrock. She looked terrifying. She looked magnificent. Check the stairwell, Greg, Sarah said, standing up and wiping the blood from her mouth. And get me a suture kit. I think I popped a stitch. Greg nodded frantically. Yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am. Sarah limped toward Trauma Room 3. She opened the door. Commander Hayes was sitting up, holding a scalpel, ready to fight. He saw Sarah and relaxed. Status? Hayes asked. Floor secure, Sarah said, leaning against the doorframe. 4 hostiles down, but they'll send a second wave. We need to move. We can't, Hayes said, nodding towards the window. Sarah looked out. Down in the parking lot, 3 black SUVs had pulled up. More men were pouring out, heavily armed men, and a helicopter was approaching from the south. Not a medevac, a blacked-out attack chopper. That's the extraction team, Hayes said grimly, or the cleanup crew. Sarah checked the magazine in the Glock. 7 rounds. Dutch, she radioed on the headset she had taken from the dead leader. Status? Pinned down in the lobby, LT, Dutch's voice came back, accompanied by the sound of heavy gunfire. We're taking heavy heat. Can't get to you. Sarah looked at Hayes. They were trapped on the 4th floor. No way down, no way out. Looks like we have to do this the hard way, Sarah said. What's the hard way? Hayes asked. Sarah looked at the oxygen tanks lining the wall. She looked at the approaching helicopter. A crazy, desperate plan formed in her mind. We're going to the roof, Sarah said. To surrender? No. Sarah's eyes flashed with cold determination. To take their ride. The receipts that proved everything. The stairwell to the roof was a vertical tunnel of concrete and darkness. Sarah didn't push the wheelchair. The stairs made that impossible. Instead, she had Commander Hayes's arm draped over her shoulder, her body acting as a crutch for his shattered frame. Every step was a battle against gravity and pain. Leave me, Hayes gritted out, sweat stinging his eyes. You can make it to the perimeter. Negative, Sarah panted, her legs burning. We leave together, or we don't leave. They burst through the heavy steel fire door and onto the roof. The world exploded into noise and wind. A sleek, matte black MH-6 Little Bird helicopter was hovering just feet above the helipad, its rotors whipping the rain into a frenzy. The downdraft was immense, tearing at Sarah's scrubs. 4 men were fast roping down from the skids. The cleaners. They hit the deck with heavy thuds, weapons raised. Sarah dragged Hayes behind a massive HVAC ventilation unit, just as bullets sparked against the metal casing. Ping, ping, ping. They have us pinned, Hayes yelled over the roar of the rotors. Sarah looked at the oxygen tank she had dragged up with them. It was a crazy gamble, a 1 in a million shot. But she was out of options. Cover your ears, Sarah screamed. She didn't aim at the men. She aimed at the valve of the pressurized oxygen cylinder lying on the concrete between them and the enemy. She leveled the Glock. She took a breath, finding the stillness in the chaos. Bang! The bullet sheared the valve off the tank. The cylinder didn't just explode, it became a missile. With a shrieking hiss of escaping gas, the heavy steel tank launched itself forward with terrifying velocity. It smashed into the legs of the lead mercenary, shattering bone, before careening into the tail rotor of the hovering helicopter. Crunch! The helicopter screamed. A mechanical shriek of tearing metal. The tail rotor disintegrated. The pilot lost yaw control. The bird began to spin violently, the torque whipping it around. The pilot fought the stick, but physics was unforgiving. The helicopter slewed sideways, its skids clipping the edge of the roof, and crashed hard onto the helipad, rolling onto its side. The rotors shattered, sending shrapnel flying like deadly confetti. The mercenaries on the roof were knocked flat by the impact. Move now, Sarah roared. She hauled Hayes up. They didn't run away from the crash. They ran toward it. The pilot was slumped over the controls, unconscious. Fuel was leaking. The engine was whining, trying to tear itself apart. Sarah yanked the pilot's door open, unbuckled him, and dragged him out onto the wet concrete. She shoved Hayes into the co-pilot seat. Can you fly? Hayes shouted, strapping in. I'm a pararescue jumper, Sarah yelled, jumping into the pilot's seat. We know enough to get home? She scanned the console. It was a digital glass cockpit. Complex. Military grade. Warning lights were flashing red. Rotor RPM. Low. Hydraulic failure. Come on, Sarah whispered, flipping switches with practiced speed. She killed the auto throttle and engaged the manual override. Outside, the surviving mercenaries were getting to their feet. They raised their rifles. Bullets shattered the windshield. Glass sprayed into the cockpit. Sarah grabbed the cyclic stick and ripped the collective up. The helicopter groaned, shuddered, and lifted. It was ugly. It lurched to the left, scraping the concrete, sparks flying. But it was airborne. Sarah kicked the pedal, swinging the nose around. She didn't fly away immediately. She dipped the nose, buzzing the mercenaries, forcing them to dive for cover. "Dutch," Sarah screamed into the headset. "Roof is clear. We have air transport. Get your team to the roof. Now." "Negative, Angel." Dutch's voice crackled, sounding strained. "We're cut off. Elevators are disabled. We're holding the lobby, but we're out of ammo." Sarah looked at the fuel gauge. Low. She looked at Hayes. He was fading again. The G-force was taking its toll. She made a choice. "Hold on," Sarah said. She pushed the stick forward. The damaged helicopter dove off the side of the building. For a terrifying second, they were free-falling toward the parking lot 4 stories below. Then Sarah pulled up at the last second, leveling out just 50 feet above the ground. She hovered right in front of the hospital's main glass entrance, the lobby where the battle was raging. Inside, Dutch and his team were pinned behind the reception desk. Blackwell operators were advancing. Sarah didn't have guns on the chopper. The crash had jammed the miniguns. But she had something else. "Brace," Sarah said. She spun the helicopter around, aiming the engine exhaust and the massive downdraft directly into the shattered lobby doors. The force of the rotor wash was like a hurricane. It blasted into the lobby, sending furniture, glass, and Blackwell operators flying backward. The dust and debris created a blinding storm. "Go, go, go!" Sarah screamed into the radio. Dutch saw the opening. He grabbed his wounded teammate. "Move to the evac zone, the parking lot." The operators sprinted out of the lobby, using the helicopter as a shield. They scrambled into the back of the hovering bird, hauling themselves onto the skids. "We're clear! Punch it!" Dutch yelled. Sarah pulled the collective. The helicopter screamed one last time and surged upward, climbing into the rainy night sky, leaving the chaos of St. Jude's Hospital behind them. Below them, flashing lights of police and FBI units were finally swarming the grounds. The cavalry had arrived, but they were 10 minutes too late. If it hadn't been for the nurse with the shaking hands, everyone would be dead. The justice nobody expected. The private airfield in Virginia was quiet. The sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across the tarmac. Sarah stood by the chain-link fence, wearing civilian clothes, jeans and a leather jacket. Her arm was in a sling, and she had a butterfly bandage over her eye. A black government sedan pulled up. Dutch got out first, looking clean-shaven and wearing a dress uniform. He opened the back door. Commander Hayes stepped out. He was on crutches, but he was standing. He wore his full dress whites. The gold trident of a Navy SEAL gleamed on his chest. He walked over to Sarah. "They told me you declined the medal," Hayes said softly. Sarah shrugged, looking at the runway. "I didn't do it for a medal. I just wanted to do my job." "You did a hell of a lot more than that," Hayes said. "Blackwell has been dismantled. The files you secured, they took down 3 corrupt senators and half the defense board. You cleaned house, Angel." "I'm retired, Commander," Sarah said. "Or I was supposed to be." Hayes reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box. "The Navy can't officially recognize what happened at that hospital," Hayes said. "But the Brotherhood can." He opened the box. Inside wasn't a medal. It was a pin, a small golden angel wing. "The guys from the squadron voted," Hayes smiled. "You're not Angel anymore. Your new call sign is Valkyrie, because you choose who lives and who dies." Sarah took the pin. She felt a lump in her throat. "What about the hospital?" Sarah asked. "Dr. Thorne?" Dutch laughed, stepping forward. "Thorne? He's currently facing federal charges for medical negligence and fraud. And get this, Administrator Sterling resigned. The board appointed a new chief of nursing." "Who?" "Jessica," Dutch grinned. She grew a backbone that night. She told the FBI everything. Sarah smiled. It was a real smile this time. So, Hayes said, the job offer still stands. We need a medic for a new task force. No red tape, no administrators, just the mission. Sarah looked at her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. She looked at Hayes, then at the horizon. When do we start? What this story is really about. Back at St. Jude's, the break room was quiet. A new nurse was restocking the shelves. Greg, the resident, walked in. He looked different, humbled. He saw the new nurse struggling with a heavy box. In the past, he would have ignored her. He would have laughed. Hey, Greg said, stepping forward. Let me get that for you. Thanks, doctor. The nurse smiled. Greg looked at the empty locker in the corner, the one that used to belong to Sarah. Someone had taped a small printed picture to it. It was a blurry photo from a security camera, showing a woman standing amidst the smoke, holding a defibrillator paddle like a shield. Underneath it, someone had written one word in Sharpie: respect. Greg tapped the photo, then turned back to the room. Carry on, he said. The legend of the nurse who was a soldier would never leave those halls, and the doctors never laughed at a new hire again. The bigger picture nobody wants to talk about. This story isn't just about combat. It's about the invisible battles people fight every day. Sarah Mitchell represents the thousands of black veterans who walk among us, carrying skills and burdens we can't see, who served their country with distinction and came home to a nation that still sees them as threats instead of heroes. The doctors judged her by her silence, mistaking trauma for weakness and humility for incompetence. They saw a middle-aged black woman with shaking hands and assumed the worst. Drugs, alcohol, failure. They never asked why her hands shook. They never asked what she'd done before. They never asked what she'd survived. They saw her blackness and her age and decided she wasn't worth their time. In a world obsessed with status and ego, where a black woman has to be twice as good to get half the recognition, Sarah reminds us that true strength doesn't need to announce itself. It just steps up when the fire starts. How many times have you dismissed someone because they didn't fit your idea of competence? How many times have you judged someone by their appearance, their age, their race, their silence? How many times have you seen a black woman and assumed she wasn't qualified? How many times have you clutched your wallet, locked your car door, or questioned someone's credentials because of the color of their skin? That janitor? That quiet co-worker? That black woman doing the grunt work nobody else wants? She might be the only one capable of saving your life. Sarah Mitchell spent 20 years saving people in the worst conditions imaginable. She came home to a country that gave her pills instead of purpose. A system that valued credentials over capability. A hospital that saw her black skin and shaking hands and assumed weakness, never asking why they shook, never asking what she'd survived. Those hands shook because they'd held dying boys in the dirt of Kandahar, because they'd performed emergency surgery under enemy fire, because they'd saved 400 lives while the people mocking her were still in medical school learning from textbooks. And when the moment came, when a white doctor froze and a Navy SEAL was dying, those shaking black hands were the steadiest thing in the room. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been dismissed because of your age, your background, the way you look, the color of your skin? Have you ever been the only black person in a room and felt every eye on you, waiting for you to fail? Have you ever been told you only got the job because of diversity quotas, not because you earned it? Have you ever worked twice as hard for half the recognition because you had to be perfect while others could be mediocre? Have you ever watched someone less qualified get promoted because they had the right connections, the right accent, the right last name, the right skin color? Have you ever done everything right and still been treated like you didn't belong? Have you ever been called articulate like it was a surprise? Have you ever had someone clutch their purse when you walked by? Have you ever been followed in a store, questioned by security, or had the police called on you for existing in a space where someone decided you didn't belong? Drop your story in the comments. Because this isn't Sarah's story alone. This is the story of every Black woman who's been underestimated, every person of color who's been told they're not enough, everyone who's had to prove themselves twice as hard for half the recognition. This is the story of everyone who's been judged by the color of their skin instead of the content of their character. Share this story. Not the sanitized version, the real version. Because the world needs to know that the people they dismiss, the Black women they overlook, the veterans they ignore, might be their only hope when everything falls apart. The Black woman mopping the floor might be the one who saves your life. The quiet person of color in the corner might be the genius you've been looking for. The washed-up, middle-aged Black worker might be the most competent person in the building. But you'll never know if you don't look past your prejudices. You'll never know if you don't see past the color of someone's skin. You'll never know if you keep judging books by their covers. Sarah Mitchell served her country for 20 years. She saved 400 lives. She became the first Black woman to complete one of the most elite military programs in the world. And when she came home, America treated her like she was nothing. Until the day she proved she was everything. Subscribe to channel. Because every week, we tell you the truth they don't want you to know. The stories of people who were dismissed, exploited, and underestimated, and the moment when they proved everyone wrong. Stay just, stay loud, stay free. And remember, true strength doesn't announce itself. It just shows up when it matters most.